official business of the United States of America, and as a result of that, the committee has a zero tolerance policy for interruptions or for attempts by anyone in the room to communicate with somebody up here or the witness. So as a result of that, if you do disrupt, you will be arrested. You'll be banned for a year. However, I'm told that we have some guests today who have completed their ban and are back with us again today. We hope you've had the time to think about your indiscretions and will behave yourself today. If you don't, as a persistent violator, you'll be banned for 3 years this time. So in any event, welcome to everyone, and certainly Secretary Rubio, we're glad to have you here, and welcome back. The new co-pilot I got, Pete, is doing just fine in the seat you used to sit in, and I'm glad to have him. Thank you so much for being here. We were a little afraid we were going to lose you to the Miami Dolphins there for a while, but I guess that went a different direction, so it's certainly our gain. I'd like to start this hearing on the Venezuela situation by recognizing the brave men and women who participated in this operation. The intelligence gathering, planning, and execution were incredible. Only the U.S. could have pulled off this mission, and that's only because of the dedication and professionalism of each and every one of our service members. As we know, much of their work is done in secret, but I do hope these people will receive the accolades that they so rightly deserve. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of President Trump that he has shown, and also you, Secretary Rubio. It's no easy job keeping drugs and narco-terrorists off our streets and keeping Americans safe. Thank you for extraditing Nicolas Maduro and bringing him to account for his many crimes against the American people. Let me reiterate a point that I've made many times on the Senate floor. President Trump's actions against narco-terrorists and his capture of Maduro have made America safer. Every American should be thanking Donald Trump and Marco Rubio for what they have done. There are a lot of Americans today who wouldn't be alive if not for your commitment and dedication to stemming the flow of drugs into our country. The actions in Venezuela were limited in scope, short in duration, and done to protect U.S. interests and citizens. What President Trump has done in Venezuela is the definition of the president's Article 2 constitutional authorities as commander-in-chief, and wholly consistent with what other presidents' efforts and what they have done and actions they have taken to protect the American people from threats in our own hemisphere. In fact, President George H.W. Bush authorized similar, but much broader and more extensive military operations to arrest and bring Panama's Manuel Noriega to the United States to stand trial for drug-related charges. In that case, President Bush deployed more than 9,000 troops into Panama for more than a month. At the time, all leaders of the Senate, including Democrats, praised that move. Unlike in Panama, President Trump authorized a much more limited military action in Venezuela, with only about 200 troops inside the country for a couple of hours and a firefight that lasted less than 27 minutes, with no loss of life on the United States side, but significant casualties on the other side. This military action was incredibly brief, targeted, and successful. When bad guys are in the business of flying drugs into the United States, drugs that kill our children, hurt our country, violate U.S. laws, and destabilize our hemisphere, then they'll have to be held to answer for those actions, and that's what's being done now. Maduro was not recognized as a legitimate leader of Venezuela by President Trump, or even by President Biden, or by most of the international community. It is a service to the world that this illegitimate leader is no longer in power. Now the United States has a tremendous opportunity before us in Venezuela. Because of the complexity of this operation, there has been some confusion as to how it will be done. I've been impressed by the way you, Secretary Rubio, have explained the plan to me going forward right from the start. It is clear and it's doable. I know you'll lay that out for us here today. Venezuela's natural resources have frequently been used to bolster the economy of our adversaries, especially China. Through President Trump's actions, we have effectively cut off that supply, giving the United States tremendous leverage. After our lengthy engagements in the Middle East in years past, many Americans are rightfully concerned about so-called forever wars. I know this administration is laser focused on avoiding those experiences. With Nicolas Maduro out of power, the United States has the opportunity to better protect America by bringing stability to Venezuela. The country has a history of democracy, capitalism, and a respect for human rights. It is only during the last two dictatorships that it has lost these attributes. The Venezuelan people are not strangers to these concepts and long to have them reinstated. They have you and the President Trump to thank for giving them another chance. It is all our hope that the Venezuelan people will soon be able to hold free and fair elections for their leaders. To get there, Venezuela may require U.S. and international oversight to ensure these elections are indeed free and fair, unlike their most recent elections. Secretary Rubio, thank you for being here today. I look forward to a productive discussion, and with that, I'd like to hear the distinguished ranking member's views on these matters. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Secretary Rubio. Thank you for being here. I certainly agree with the chairman in terms of his comments relative to Nicolas Maduro. He was bad for Venezuela, he was bad for the region, and he was bad for the United States. I think the question we have to ask now is, was the raid to arrest him worth the cost? And I also share the chairman's admiration for the military operation that took him out. But the U.S. naval blockade around Venezuela and the raid have already cost American taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. Outside estimates are as high as $1 billion. And yet, the Maduro regime is essentially still in power. All the same people are running the country. Maduro's vice president, now the interim president, has taken no steps to diminish Iran, China, or Russia's considerable influence in Venezuela. One of the reasons that has been given for the mission. Her cooperation appears tactical and temporary and not a real shift in Venezuela's alignment. In the process, we've traded one dictator for another. So it's no wonder that so many of my constituents are asking, why is the president spending so much time focused on Venezuela instead of the cost of living and their kitchen table economic concerns? Unfortunately, I think this has been a pattern across the administration, losing sight of what actually advances America's interests and delivers results for the American people. Take the elimination of personnel and departments that were critical to our national security, for example. These are cost-effective tools like Voice of America that help us advance America's interests globally. And Mr. Secretary, as you remember, you strongly supported most of these programs when you were on this side of the dais. The administration says those cuts were about saving money, but the total federal spending last year went up by 4%, not down. We spent more, not less. As a result, our adversaries like China are expanding their influence. And there is broad bipartisan agreement in Congress that China is the central strategic challenge of our time. The president himself has said that as well. But we're cutting foreign aid and diplomacy tools. We're leaving embassies without leadership. We're shutting down counter-disinformation programs. We are driving talent away from the United States while Beijing is actively recruiting it. And I would just like to point out, this is a picture of the globe. These are countries where China has ambassadors in those countries. All of the red, those are China. And places where their diplomats are on the ground, except of course for China, which is in blue, and they don't need to put diplomats there. This map, this is where we have diplomats. You can see the red is where we're filled, and look at all of the white, where we do not have ambassadors on the ground. We're even giving China some of our most advanced semiconductors. And after a year of tariffs that were supposed to make us stronger, China has posted the largest trade surplus in history. And American families are paying more at a time when the prices were already too high. Since the start of the tariff campaign in 2025, U.S. manufacturing employment has fallen by anywhere from 50 to 70,000 jobs, depending on whose estimates you look at. That's a trend that undercuts promises that tariffs would bring factory jobs roaring back. And instead of creating a united front against China, we're pushing our closest allies into their arms. Just look at Canada, whose business with the state of New Hampshire has been really critical. They recently cut a trade deal with China because they no longer view the United States as a reliable partner. Pushing allies away like that is not strategic competition, it is unilateral disarmament. We see the same gap between rhetoric and reality in how this administration deals with other authoritarian regimes. At a time when Iran is violently cracking down on protests, the U.S. is coming to agreements to deport Iranians in this country back to Iran, people who will face persecution and interrogation by Iranian security forces. And yet President Trump told the Iranian people that help was on the way. But the United States has largely stood on the sidelines as the situation has deteriorated. Americans are right in thinking that the Trump administration is tougher on our allies than on most of our adversaries. I just returned from Denmark, where I met with Danish and Greenlandic leaders. Senator Coons was also on that trip. He led it. What I heard directly is that President Trump's threats to take Greenland have shaken public confidence in the United States to the core. And this from an ally who first recognized the new United States of America in 1792, has fought on our side in both world wars and in Afghanistan. And I heard from one Danish-American woman whose son holds both citizenships and is approaching conscription age, that she's worried that her son might one day be forced to choose between the two countries that he loves. That kind of fear would have been unthinkable 2 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 50 years ago. There is no strategic objective in Greenland that cannot be achieved through cooperation. The only thing these threats have accomplished is weakening trust in the United States. That trust is the foundation of our alliances. And at a moment when Russia is waging the largest land war in Europe since World War II, we should be strengthening Allied unities. Instead, we're undermining it. European allies are worried about open conflict with the United States. Canadian trading partners are turning toward China instead of the U.S. And the constant threat of new tariffs raising prices and making it impossible for businesses to invest is ever present. So, from Venezuela to Europe, the United States is spending more, risking more, and achieving less. That does not project strength. It hands our adversaries exactly what they want. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. We're now going to hear from Secretary Rubio. After that, we'll do a round of 5-minute questions. And so with that, Secretary Rubio, welcome back to the committee. Love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'll be brief in my opening statement so we can leave more time for questions. I've submitted a written statement, but I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to talk to you guys for a few minutes. And
all right, here we go. Suspend. You know the drill. Off to jail.
That's a war crime.
That's a 1-year ban from the committee. Anyone who is a persistent violator will be banned for 3 years. So don't know whether the guy falls in that category. Looks like it. I hope after 3 years he'll find a more productive means of employment. Secretary Rubio, we have 2 hearings a week. You know, you seem to have a more robust following than most of our witnesses that come before us. But anyway.
there'll be a couple more, so thank you for stopping the clock, but I appreciate it. So, and I know there's a lot of other topics you're going to ask me about, so we can talk about those, including the ones that Senator Shaheen just outlined. But let me just talk about Venezuela in particular.
Please.
I think we can talk, if you want. I'm sure your questions will be about what happened before and led up to in the operation. I want to focus my comments this morning on what happens now, moving forward, because you're going to ask about the going back. And let me just say this. What is our goal going in? We had in our hemisphere a regime operated by an indicted narco-trafficker that became a base of operation for virtually every competitor, adversary, and enemy in the world. It was, for Iran, their primary spot of operation in the Western Hemisphere was Venezuela. For Russia, their primary base of operation in the Western Hemisphere, along Cuba and Nicaragua, was Venezuela. In the case of China, China was receiving oil at a huge, about $20 a barrel discount. And they weren't even paying money for it. It was being used to pay down debt that they were owed. This is the oil of the people of Venezuela, and it was being given to the Chinese as barter at a 20%, at a $20 discount per barrel in some cases. And so you had basically 3 of our primary opponents in the world operating from our hemisphere from that spot. It was also a place where you had a narco-trafficking regime that openly cooperated with the FARC and the ELN and other drug trafficking organizations using their national territory. It was an enormous strategic risk for the United States, not halfway around the world, not in another continent, but in the hemisphere in which we all live. And it was having dramatic impacts on us, but also on Colombia and on the Caribbean basin and all sorts of other places. It was an untenable situation, and it had to be addressed. And it was addressed. And now the question becomes what happens moving forward. As I've described to you in previous settings and in individual conversations, we had 3 objectives here. The final, I'll work it backwards, because the end state here is we want to reach a phase of transition where we are left with a friendly, stable, prosperous Venezuela, and democratic, in which all elements of society are represented in free and fair elections. By the way, you can have elections. You can have elections all day. But if the opposition has no access to the media, if opposition candidates are routinely dismissed and unable to be on the ballot because the government, those aren't free and fair elections. That's the end state that we want: free, fair, prosperous, and friendly Venezuela. We're not going to get there in 3 weeks. It's going to take some time. And so objective number 1 was stability. In the aftermath of the removal of Maduro, the concern was what happens in Venezuela. Is there civil war? Do the different factions start going at each other? Are 1 million people crossing the border into Colombia? All of that has been avoided. And one of the primary ways that it has been avoided is the ability to establish direct, honest, respectful, but very direct and honest conversations with the people who today control the elements of that nation, meaning the law enforcement, the government apparatus, etc. And one of the tools that's available to us is the fact that we have sanctions on oil. There is oil that is sanctioned that cannot move from Venezuela because of our quarantine. And so what we did is we entered into an arrangement with them. And the arrangement is this: on the oil that is sanctioned in quarantine, we will allow you to move it to market. We will allow you to move it to market at market prices, not at the discount China was getting. In return, the funds from that will be deposited into an account that we will have oversight over. And you will spend that money for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. Why was that important? Venezuela was running out of storage capacity. Okay? They were producing oil, they were drilling oil, they had nowhere to put it. They had nowhere to move it, and they were facing a fiscal crunch. They needed money in the immediacy to fund the police officer, the sanitation workers, the daily operations of government. And so we've been able to create a short-term mechanism. This is not going to be the permanent mechanism, but this is a short-term mechanism in which the needs of the Venezuelan people can be met through a process that we've created, where they will submit every month a budget of this is what we need funded. We will provide for them at the front end what that money cannot be used for. And they've been very cooperative in this regard. In fact, they have pledged to use a substantial amount of those funds to purchase medicine and equipment directly from the United States. As in fact, one of the things they need is dilutin, or dilutin, depending how you want to pronounce it. And that basically is the light crude that you need to mix with their heavy crude in order for the oil to be able to be mixed and moved. They used to get 100% of that from Russia. They are now getting 100% of that from the United States. So we're using that short-term mechanism both to stabilize the country, but also to make sure that the oil proceeds that are currently being generated through the licenses we'll now begin to issue on the sanctioned oil goes to the benefit of the Venezuelan people, not to fund the system that existed in the past. The second is a period of recovery, and that is the phase in which you want to see a normalized oil industry. Again, look, we've got plenty of oil. There's plenty of oil all over the world. Canada produces heavy crude, so it's not like Venezuela's oil is unique in that regard, despite the fact they have the largest known reserves in the world. It's not irreplaceable. But we understand that that is the lifeline. Their natural resources are going to allow Venezuela to be stable and prosperous moving forward. And so we have created what we hope to do is transition to a mechanism that allows that to be sold in a normal way, a normal oil industry, not one dominated by cronies, not one dominated by graft and corruption. To that end, the authorities there deserve some credit. They have passed a new hydrocarbon law that basically eradicates many of the Chavez-era restrictions on private investment in the oil industry. It probably doesn't go far enough to attract sufficient investment, but it's a big step from where they were 3 weeks ago. So that's a major change. We can address some of the other components, but I'll run out of time. But one of the parts of the transition phase, or the recovery phase, is beginning to create space for different voices inside of Venezuelan politics to have an ability to speak out. Part of that is the release of political prisoners. By some estimates, up to 2,000. They are releasing them. They are releasing them probably slower than I would like them to. but they are releasing them. And in fact, you're starting to see some of the people being released beginning to speak out and participate in political life in the country. We have a long ways to go. Look, we can talk in more detail about all of these things. Suffice it to say, I'm not here to claim to you this is going to be easy or simple. I am saying that in 3.5, almost 4 weeks, we are much further along on this project than we thought we would be, given the complexities of it going into it. And I recognize that it won't be easy. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we are dealing with people over there that have spent most of their lives living in a gangster paradise. So it's not going to be like from one day to the next, we're going to have this thing turn around overnight. But I think we're making good and decent progress. It is the best plan, and we are certainly better off today in Venezuela than we were 4 weeks ago. And I think and hope and expect that we'll be better off in 3 months, in 6 months, in 9 months than we would have been had Maduro still been there. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Secretary Rubio. We'll now do a round of questions, 5 minutes each. I'd like to start, and I'd ask you to go, I understand we're not in a classified setting, but I think a lot of people had no understanding of the groundwork that was done before the actual action took place. I was incredibly impressed with what you told me about how you, the president, negotiated with parties there on the ground, particularly the parties who were going to be in charge after Maduro was removed. And I wonder if you could talk about that for a minute, understanding that we aren't in a classified setting. And I'd like to, if you could, say a few things about it.
Well, one of the things I've come to maybe more fully appreciate than I didn't when I was here in the Senate was the number of contingencies that the Department of War plans for all over the world. The overwhelming vast majority of them will never come to fruition, but there's all kinds of contingencies that are planned for. And one contingency that had to be planned for is the fact that sitting in Venezuela with a $50 million reward on his head was an indicted narco trafficker. In fact, I believe it's the largest reward we've ever issued for anybody. I remind everybody the Biden administration had a $25 million reward on an indicted narco trafficker, the same person. And so, multiple administrations from both parties have wanted this man arrested. And one of the options the president had before him was the opportunity, if things didn't work out, to go in and remove this individual because he was wanted in a law enforcement operation. Now, obviously, a law enforcement operation against the de facto head of a regime is not as simple as going after some fugitive hiding in a closet somewhere. It required planning, and it required eliminating anything that was a threat to the forces that were going in to extract him. I want to be clear, and I'll share with you what I've shared publicly. We made multiple attempts to get Maduro to leave voluntarily and to avoid all of this because we understood that he was an impediment to progress. You couldn't make a deal with this guy. Okay? This guy has made multiple deals. He's broken every one of them. As a point of example, he made a deal with the Biden administration, and here was the deal that he made. It was a bad deal. We knew he wouldn't keep it. He made the following deal. Pardon my nephews, his nephews, who are convicted narco traffickers, convicted already and serving time in jail, pardon them, pardon and release Alex Saab, who was his money man, his bag man, primarily in charge of the portfolio with Iran. Release these people. He, in turn, agreed to release some political prisoners, which he did. Many of them were subsequently exiled or rearrested, and that he would hold free and fair elections, which he did not. In fact, he basically disqualified Maria Corina Machado and any other candidate. And Edmundo Gonzalez ends up being the nominee for the opposition party simply because they forgot to ban him. And they forgot to put him on the ban list. And then despite that, he loses an election that everyone around the world recognizes an illegitimate election. So he's made previous deals. In fact, he's broken so many deals, not even the Vatican has been willing to interact with Maduro in the past because he's broken so many of these deals. He's just simply not a guy you can make a deal with. He had no intent of keeping it. What he wanted to do was tap us along and buy 3 years of time until he could deal with a new administration that he thought may be more favorable, et cetera. He was an impediment to progress. None of the things we're talking about now, not the release of political prisoners, not the transition of the oil industry to a legitimate oil industry, not the erosion of Iranian, Russian, or Chinese influence. None of these things would have been possible as long as Maduro was there. And so this was one option that was available to the president after exhausting every other option to remove this individual from the scene. Again, I'm not here to tell you these are all going to be roses along the way and it's all going to go perfectly. But for the first time in 20 years, we are having serious counter-narcotic talks with Venezuelan authorities about going after narcotics organizations. For the first time in 20 years, we are having serious conversations about eroding and eliminating the Iranian presence, the Chinese influence, the Russian presence as well. In fact, I would tell you that there are many elements there in Venezuela that welcome a return to establishing relations to the United States on multiple fronts. We are at the end talking about a Western country that has a long history of cooperation and work with the United States. At one time, Venezuela, pre-Chavez, was a very strong U.S. ally. And we hope to get back to that point. We're not there. This thing still is in its infancy. But I certainly think a lot of progress has been made in that regard.
I was impressed with your description of the fact how careful you were in the operation not to dismantle either institutions or infrastructure because you wanted to see the Venezuelan people take that over and get back on their feet again. I think that was really a wise decision to make and have it as surgical as it was. The last thing I'd ask about, if you could touch on for just a minute, is I know you spent a considerable period of time negotiating with the people that were going to do day-to-day operations, the Venezuelans who were going to fill the vacuum. How's that going, and how do you feel about where we are there?
Well, first of all, let me understand something. I spent 14 years in the U.S. Senate going after these people pretty hard, along with many of you. So, I mean, I understand who they are, and I understand this portfolio from a personal level quite well. So we're very realistic about what we're dealing with here. We also understand that in geopolitics, sometimes that's required. And in this particular case, there are an alignment of interests. And we certainly think that the approach we're taking is preferable to some of the other alternatives that people speculate about or fear. And I would say at this point, I do have to characterize, again, being realistic, clear-eyed, and understanding that there will be impediments and unexpected events along the way. What we have found so far is cooperation, respect, dialogue, and it's not just me. As has been reported in the media, Director Radcliffe traveled to Caracas and met with leaders there and discussed important items of potential cooperation. I've also discussed, and I think I've alerted some of you, that we have Laura Dogue, who was our ambassador to Nicaragua in the past and to Honduras, will be taking over the Venezuelan Affairs Unit, first in Bogota, but ultimately in Caracas. We've had a team on the ground already there. We already had 70 locally employed that sort of maintain that facility, but we have a team on the ground there assessing it, and we think very quickly we'll be able to open a U.S. diplomatic presence on the ground, which will allow us to have real-time information and interact, by the way, not just with officials in the regime and with the interim authorities, but also interact with members of civil society, the opposition. We think we're going to be much further along when we get them along the way. They've been very cooperative on that front. Obviously, there's some hard asks along the way. We'll see what the response is to those. But whether it's General Kane with his counterpart, or Director Radcliffe, or myself with Delcy Rodriguez, we've established what I think so far has been a very respectful and productive line of communication as we go through this stabilization phase and towards the recovery phase. But there's a lot of work to be done here, and we ultimately are going to judge actions, not words, and that's what we're hoping to work towards.
Well done, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. I'm pleased that we are looking at a diplomatic presence in Venezuela in the near future. I think that's very important. But the DEA has reportedly identified Delcy Rodriguez as a significant actor in the drug trade. Do you agree with that? And if you do, how are we to assure the American people that the money that's going to Venezuela is not going to any of the cartels or drug running?
Yeah, and well, first of all, on the first point, I would say she's not indicted the way Maduro and his wife were. So I'm not going to speculate about newspaper articles and what law enforcement is working on. If in fact there were such an investigation, that's something that we would speculate on. Suffice it to say that this was not a normal system. We all should stipulate to that, okay? That regime, as everyone understood, was held together by corruption. The glue that kept people together was not loyalty to Maduro. It was the fact that these 5 guys had 5 separate oil fields that were assigned to them. These people had drug routes.
I understand that.
So that's going to be clear.
I'm not defending the regime. In fact, I'm concerned that we haven't really changed the regime enough, and that America's dollars are still going to drug runners and to significant organizations who we don't want to have benefit from the funding that we're selling now of oil and providing to the Venezuelan government.
Look, I acknowledge that we are dealing with, as I told you, with individuals that have been involved in things that in our system would not be acceptable, would not be acceptable to us in the long term. By no means is our policy to leave in place something permanent that's as corrupt as you've described. we are in the transition and stabilization phase. We are just acknowledging reality, and that is you have to work with the people that are in charge of the elements of government.
Okay, but
now,
can
what
you
are the
reassure
systems?
people that
Yeah, so the
money
way
is
that-
not going,
Yeah,
continuing to go to the drug cartels?
Right, so that's the process that I outlined to you. So on the sanctioned oil, the oil that requires U.S. permission to move, that oil, the proceeds of that oil, which by the way is being sold at market price, not at the discount Venezuela was being
Right.
forced to sell, is being deposited into an account that ultimately will become a U.S. Treasury blocked account here in the United States. They will submit, we will at the front end say this is what this money can be spent on these things. We will submit to them, they will submit to us a budget request. We want to use this money for these things. And part of the proceeds will go to fund a audit process to make sure that that's how the money is being spent.
So
and that's
there
how
is-
we intend to handle those funds in the short term.
There's an actual audit process that's been set up? Who is
It will be set up, and
responsible?
we have a couple options. One option is the XM Bank. They have expertise as bankers and being able to do some of that option. There may be some others in place. We haven't finalized what that audit process would be. We've only made one payment, and that payment we did, and retrospectively will be audited. But it was important we made that payment because they had to meet payroll. They had to keep sanitation workers, police officers, government workers on staff. It was a $300 million payment.
Right, so it's been reported that the oil sold for $500 million, that $300 million went to Venezuelan government. What happened to the other $200 million?
It's still sitting in the account, is my understanding at this time.
The account in Qatar?
Well, the account, yes, but that will ultimately be that's a short-term account. Ultimately, it will be a U.S. Treasury blocked account in the United States.
And will it also be audited?
Correct. Well, the audit will be on the expenditures. At the front end, we'll tell them this is what the money can be spent on. Again, I'm not talking about all the other revenues the Venezuelan government may have. We're talking about the revenues from the sanctioned oil. At the front end, we will say this is what the allowable expenses are. And then they will agree to fund, as part of the overall cost, they will pay for and fund an audit system acceptable to us to ensure that that's how the money was spent.
And can you report to this committee once that audit system is set up?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I'd like to change the topic in my short time that I have left, because when you were a member of this committee, you authored legislation to prevent President Trump from unilaterally leaving NATO, you and Senator Kaine. Do you still believe that the U.S. benefits from NATO?
We do. I mean, the problem, but NATO needs to be reimagined as well in terms of the obligations. And this is not new to this president. Multiple presidents have complained about it.
I
think
agree.
this president just complains about it louder than other presidents.
Well, I'm just trying to be get a clear answer on where this administration stands relative to NATO, because it's been a very fuzzy message over the last year. And do you agree that we're stronger in confronting China when we do so with like-minded partners, and that China is still the #1 threat that we face in the United States?
Yeah, but our like-minded partners have to have capability, and that's been part of the problem, is the erosion in European defense capabilities, because they've taken vast amount of the monies that these are rich countries. And because of the NATO umbrella, it gave them the flexibility to spend a tremendous amount of their revenues on social programs and not on defense. Now, maybe that trend
But-
line will begin to change.
Well,
but
it's
it
already
needs to.
begun to change, frankly, and thanks. And I think the president deserves credit for that, for the fact that there is now a commitment for 5% of GDP to be spent on defense. But part of that strength also comes not just from having the mechanism, the military might, but it also comes from the unity with our allies. And to the extent to which that unity is undermined, like the talk about Greenland and antagonizing Denmark, then it undermines NATO's ability. And the only people who are excited about that are Vladimir Putin and President Xi.
Yeah, well, I would say that I think our alliances in NATO ultimately are something that's going to work out. Our partners understand the importance of the U.S. presence in NATO. Without the U.S., there is no NATO. And we understand that in order for NATO to be stronger, our partners need to be stronger. And one of the things we've explained to our allies in NATO is the United States is not simply focused on Europe. We also have defense needs in the Western Hemisphere. We have defense needs in the Indo-Pacific. And it will require us. We may be the richest country in the world, but we don't have unlimited resources. And as we reassign
Exactly
resources,
why we want to have allies and partners to help us as we're looking at conflicts around the world. And when we antagonize our allies and partners, and when we send Canada to do a trade deal with China instead of coming to New Hampshire or the United States, it weakens our ability to confront our adversaries.
yeah, but our allies have to be two things. They have to be willing to step up, but they also have to be capable of stepping up. And frankly, many of them have not. I mean, Spain is still not doing the 5%. I mean, there are countries that are still not doing. And in fact, Mark Rutte yesterday pointed out that if without the United States, the countries of Europe would have to spend 10% of their GDP for the next 20 years to be able to make up the whole. So I do think there needs to be a rebalancing, and hopefully we'll have cooperation. I think we will. Rute has done a great job of managing all
And
that.
I'm not arguing that point with you. As I said, I agree with what the president has asked of our European allies. What I'm arguing with you about is that his rhetoric is undermining NATO and our partnerships with our allies, and that's a problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary Rubio, for being here. So some of the comments from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are difficult to square with the record. The goalposts didn't move, nor did Maduro change. The only thing that changed was President Trump acted on what members of both parties said needed to happen. And did so, by the way, with an operation that will go down in history as one of the most impressive and tactically proficient to be ever carried out. So, Secretary Rubio, I'd like to get your response to a few yes or no questions. I know that's typically not your nature, but please bear with me here a moment, okay?
All right, let's hear them first. I hate game shows. Go ahead.
For years, the United States had a standing bounty on Nicolas Maduro, correct?
Have what, I'm sorry?
A standing bounty on Nicolas Maduro.
Oh, yes.
And this bounty was increased by both the Biden and Trump administrations, correct?
Correct.
And despite that bounty, did Maduro remain in power?
Yes.
Did he continue to support drug traffickers?
Oh, yes.
Was Operation Absolute Resolve a law enforcement operation supported by the military?
It was.
Did that operation successfully remove Maduro and his wife, and they were taken into custody?
Yes. Great questions.
Thanks. Were any service members, law enforcement officers killed in that operation?
Not any of ours.
None of ours, right. Has there largely been a broad support across Latin America for Maduro's removal?
Yes.
And is the United States better off with Nicolas Maduro in custody?
Yes, and Venezuela too.
Right. I realize that you'll hear differing views during this hearing, but I want to at least offer my personal congratulations to you and everybody who helped carry this out, because the world is better off without Nicolas Maduro. A few weeks ago, you briefed the Senate on your three-phase plan. You've been talking about it here today on stabilization, recovery, and the transition in Venezuela. Is there anything this Congress can do to be helpful in executing on that plan?
There will be in time, there's no doubt about it. On the stabilization front, in order to stabilize it, for example, we're going to have to begin to provide some licenses through OFAC. So as an example, if a company wants to go down and explore the opportunity to do some economic activity in Venezuela, they will require a license from Treasury to be able to do that. And so that doesn't require congressional action, but I wanted you to be aware of it when you start to see some of these things. Some of these are just exploratory. The second is, I think in time, look, Venezuela is a very wealthy country. This is not a country that's going to require money from the United States to rebuild, to stabilize, to transition. It really isn't. It has the ability to be, and it has been historically, the wealthiest country in the Western in Latin and South America, in many cases. The problem is that the wealth of the country was being stolen. And so part of both the recovery and the transition phase is ensuring that you leave in place a prosperous, free, democratic, allied with the United States and friendly, but also prosperous Venezuela, where the resources of the country are being done responsibly, are being utilized responsibly and to the benefit of the people and their economy. So in time, I imagine we will be coming back to you with specific legislation that may be required to assist in that function. But we don't expect that this is going to require any spending on our part. On the contrary, unlike many of the other parts of the world we've gotten involved, Venezuela we're not spending any money in Venezuela right now other than whatever it costs to stand up our embassy.
Let me switch gears on you a little bit. One of the common criticisms after Maduro's capture was that this would incentivize communist China to take similar actions in Taiwan. In my opinion, this couldn't be further from the truth. For starters, communist China doesn't care about international law or norms. They've demonstrated that repeatedly. Just ask the Philippines. Nor does it believe in international law even applies to Taiwan. But most importantly, Xi Jinping's calculus on whether to take kinetic action against Taiwan rests solely on whether or not he believes he will be successful or not. In this sense, the tactical proficiency displayed during Operation Absolute Resolve may have actually given Xi more pause to take than in taking action in Taiwan. Because despite its massive military buildup, the PLA continues to lack the experience so clearly on display that the United States demonstrated in Maduro's capture. And the PLA leaders that do have combat experience, like General Zhang, just got purged, or at least one of them did. So, Secretary Rubio, do you believe that the operation to take Maduro into custody will have any impact on Communist China's actions or intentions toward Taiwan?
No, look, the situation on Taiwan is a G legacy project that he's made very clear that that's what he intends to do. And that's going to be irrespective of anything that happens in the world. Your point, though, is well taken, and that is the U.S. in conducting this operation, I think, was certainly startling to China, to Russia, to Iran, to any adversary around the world, because the U.S. is the only country in the world that could have done this operation.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just real briefly, I just mentioned General Zhang getting purged here. He was obviously a very important official in China. Can you share with us just your assessment on what that means, that she just purged one of these?
Well, this is, I think, part of a pattern we've seen over the last few years, which is a purge of leaders in their military. They're spending a lot of money on their military, and obviously some of these guys are stealing that money, and they're trying to address that. So it's an issue internally in their system. They're obviously not sharing with us or talking to us in depth about any of that, but it's certainly something we watch with interest.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ricketts. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Rubio. Good to be with you again. My basic question is, what are we doing here? What is the point? What is the goal of this hearing?
How do I know?
As you know well, having served on this dais alongside me for 14 years, this is an oversight hearing. And the point, the purpose of oversight is to encourage, if necessary, to compel consultation between the administration and Congress. And I just wanted to raise with you at the outset, of course the Commander-in-Chief has, under Article 2, the power to defend the American people against an imminent threat or an incoming attack. How else could we be kept safe? But our Article 1 power requires consultation. I'll agree with all of my colleagues. Nicolas Maduro's a bad guy. He was indicted. There was a bounty on his head over several administrations. His removal, flawlessly executed by American troops, thankfully none of them hurt, did cost the lives of 75 to 100 Venezuelans and Cubans, was a dangerous and high-risk maneuver. I am glad that it ended as well as it possibly could. But the point here that I want to make first is that it was rehearsed for months. The administration had a number of contingencies it was trying to navigate through. But over the course of months, when the administration was taking strike after strike after strike against drug trafficking boats, in several instances where senior leaders of the administration briefed this committee and others, we were told that military action to remove Maduro was not on the table, that the campaign to try and deter drug trafficking was not going to include the exact military action that followed. Yet it was being rehearsed. If there was time to practice, there was time to consult. And consulting with Congress is not just some high-minded principle, not some abstract thing, not a nice to have, it's a got to have. And look, the chairman opened by saying that this was limited in scope and duration, that it was executed flawlessly, and we should all be happy about the result. That much I agree with. But our president continues to threaten Delcy Rodriguez and the remnant of the Maduro regime with military force if they don't comply. We should know, what are the policies, what is the path, what is the plan forward? You and I both know the long and painful history of wars that began and seemed to be resolved and then opened up into excruciating, expensive, years-long conflicts. In Iraq in particular, in Libya and elsewhere, things do not always go as planned. And so consultation with Congress that is truthful and forthcoming and transparent is critical. In your service in this body, you knew that, you experienced it. I was in the room as you held to account members of previous administrations for not coming forward as they should have. So, look, in order to avoid our men and women in our armed forces going into harm's way, doubting whether they have the support of the Congress, consultation, hearings, and deliberations are required. I understand the risk of leaks. That's a risk every administration takes. But at the end of the day, our framers entrusted the power of the declaration of war to this body, not to the executive. And where there is the time to consult, there has to be consultation. Second, I just wanted to talk about allies and alliances. I was just in Europe. I led a bipartisan delegation, as Senator Shaheen referenced, to Denmark. And our president's comments about NATO, about Denmark, and his attempts to coerce Denmark into giving up Greenland are appalling. They profoundly harmed our security. And I am asking you to do everything you can to reinforce our commitment to NATO. I was concerned that you just said NATO needs to be reimagined. Let's just be clear about the record. You know as well as I, Article 5 has only been invoked once, and it was in defense of us after we were attacked. Danes and soldiers from almost every other NATO ally deployed and served, fought and died. 52 days. And for me, the most emotional moment of my visit to Denmark was laying a wreath at the memorial to the Danes who served, fought, and died alongside Americans. So when our president says we never asked for anything from NATO, and they never gave us anything, and you suggest that they aren't carrying their weight, whether it's in bases, or in access, or in troops, or in service, it is allies that will keep us safe in the Indo-Pacific. Our treaty allies, Korea and Japan and Australia and the Philippines, are going to be critical to Indo-Pacific security against our principal threat, China. And in Europe, I'm worried that the very foundations of trust are being shaken. Our democracy depends on consultation with Congress that is truthful and timely, and the confidence of our allies depends on them knowing where we're going next. Today, an armada is steaming towards Iran. Our president is on social media threatening Iran, and I hope I can count on you, Mr. Secretary, to consult with us and inform us before our next actions, whether against Nigeria, Colombia, Cuba, Iran, or anywhere else. And I hope and believe that I can count on you to reinforce the sanctity of NATO, not to reimagine it, but to reinforce it.
Thank you. Well, let me unpack the 3 points you touched upon: consultation, NATO, Greenland, alliances in Greenland. Let me tell you on the consultation. Look, this has been a point of tension, not just in this administration and Congress, but in multiple administrations, as you rightly pointed out. I was a big fan of consultation when I was sitting over there. Now, you know, it's a different job, different time. But it's not. That's not necessarily the point. This is a very unique situation that we faced here. The fact of the matter is that our mission, and the one you were briefed on and talked about, that mission remains ongoing, and that is the counter-narcotic mission that we continue to carry out. As controversial as it may be, you may not all be fans of it, obviously, but it is happening in the Eastern Pacific, and it is also happening in the Caribbean Basin. The problem is, or the good news is, there aren't a lot of drug boats moving in the Caribbean Basin anymore, and that's what we had briefed Congress upon. This specific mission that you've talked about, one of the reasons why you rehearse it is to see if it's even feasible, to basically go to the president and say, is this something that's even an option on the table? The truth of the matter is that this mission could not have been briefed to Congress because it wasn't even in the realm of possible until very late in December, when all of our efforts to negotiate with Maduro had failed, and the president was finally presented these options and made these decisions. It was also a trigger-based operation. It may never have happened. It required a number of factors to all align at the right place at the right time in a very limited window, and it wasn't even clear if it was ever going to be possible. There's also the aspect which I do not control, and that is deference to the Department of War on operational security. Despite the fact that we had kept this quite constrained, the truth of the matter is that this was leaked. We now know it was leaked by a contractor at the Department of War that, had it been published, would have endangered the lives of people and/or would have probably canceled the ability to carry out the mission. So this is a real tension, and one that I'm doing the best I can to try to manage within the constraints of two things: operational security and also decisions being made. There are multiple contingencies for events all over the world, including some that none of us think were ever going to come to fruition. And in this particular case, one of the reasons why you rehearse these things in advance is to know whether it's even possible. Is this even doable? And what are the risks associated with doing? So you can present options to the president, who ultimately makes these decisions. In the case of reimagining NATO, it most certainly has to be reimagined. And the reason why it has to be reimagined is not because its purpose is reimagined. Its capabilities have to be reimagined. Let me give you as a point of example. There's a lot of talk about security guarantees. And it's something that there's general agreement about now with the case of Ukraine. But those security guarantees basically involve the deployment of a handful of European troops, primarily French in the UK, and then a U.S. backstop. But in fact, the security guarantee is the U.S. backstop. It is not and I'm not diminishing the fact that some countries in Europe are willing to place troops in a post-war Ukraine. What I'm pointing out is that is irrelevant without the U.S. backstop. And the reason why you need such a strong U.S. backstop is because our allies and our partners have not invested enough in their own defense capabilities over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, hopefully that's going to change. Hopefully that is changing. And in some cases and in some particular countries, it's already changed. But this is a fact that we cannot ignore. NATO is going to be stronger if our allies are more capable, especially, and here's the reality, whether we want to accept it or not, we have interests all over the world. We have interests in the Middle East, we have interests in the Western Hemisphere, and we most certainly have interests in the Indo-Pacific. A number of you have already pointed out that China is the chief challenge. We can't have the same soldiers or the same ships in both Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. We have to pick. No matter how many ships we build, no matter how many capabilities we grow, we're going to have to make these adjustments. And the stronger our partners are in NATO, the more flexibility the United States will have to secure our interests in different parts of the world. That's not an abandonment of NATO. That is a reality of the 21st century and the world that's changing now. In the case of Greenland, I'll say we're in a good place right now. We had excellent meetings with the Secretary General of NATO. In fact, even as I speak to you now, there'll be some technical level meetings between us and our partners in Greenland and Denmark on this issue. And I think we have in place a process that's going to bring us to a good outcome for everybody. The President's interest on Greenland has been clear. It's a national security interest. It's a long-standing interest that predate this administration. It's one that our allies acknowledge is real. I think we're going to get something positive done. We're going to begin that process in a very professional, straightforward way. It begins today, and it'll be a regular process. We're going to try to do it in a way that isn't like a media circus every time these conversations happen, because we think that creates more flexibility on both sides to arrive at a positive outcome. And I think we're going to get there. And I thought it was noteworthy and important that despite your concerns, the President at his speech in Davos made very clear that the United States was not going to use force or military force in Greenland. So I think we're going to wind up in a good place. We got a little bit of work to do, but I think we're going to wind up in a good place. And I think you'll hear the same from our colleagues in Europe very shortly.
Mr. Secretary, the Gang of Eight has never leaked.
Senator,
It is critical that you consult with Congress. For us to be safe, our allies have to trust us. And for this committee to do our work, we have to trust you. Let's
you.
work together to restore
thank you,
that.
Senator. Senator McCormick.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Defending American interests in the face of Russian, Iranian, and Chinese encroachment in the Western Hemisphere is a key to the Trump corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. But Venezuela's new interim leader, in her public commentary at least, defends their ties to Russia, Iran, and the PRC, and had said this week had enough of U.S. interference. So beyond the oil leverage, which you talked about in your testimony, what steps is the administration taking to demand from the interim government to put incentives in place to ensure that they prevent malign actors, foreign terror organizations, and so forth from continuing to have influence and safe haven in Venezuela?
Yeah, it's I mean, yes, there's leverage, and I wouldn't just say oil. I think anything that's sanctioned in Venezuela, will, in order for them to normalize it, will require cooperation with the United States. But it's not just leverage, it's also their national interest. It's an alignment of their interest. The truth of the matter is that the United States will be a far better partner for a future Venezuelan government that's free and democratic, and even for the current authorities, than some of the partners they've signed up with now. Frankly, we think it's not in Venezuela's interest to have an Iranian presence or the sale of Iranian weaponry or anything like that into their country. So I think there's alignment there. We think and can argue that some of these criminal elements, which they've allowed to act with impunity in parts of their country, is a deal with the devil. In the short term, it provided revenues to some corrupt regime officials, but in the long term has created real destabilization, not for just them, by the way, but also for Colombia. Just understand something. The FARC dissidents and the ELN operate with impunity from Venezuelan territory. They control Venezuelan territory.
Yeah.
And some of that was through deals with individuals aligned with the regime because they made money off of that. But we don't think that's in the long-term interest.
Do they agree?
And what's been expressed to us by leaders of the interim authorities is that they agree. And now we're going to test
Despite
it.
the public commentary, there's a recognition, you think, and progress.
Look, we all have politics.
Yeah.
Even in places like that. Suffice it to say what I've said from the very beginning, and that is we are going to judge based on actions, not words. And that's going both ways. You can tell us you're going to do all these great things. If you don't do them, you didn't do them. Or you can say, I'm not going to do these great things, but if you do them, you did them.
Good.
And I think we can point to some things now that show you, just as an example. Think about it. Within 2.5 weeks of Maduro's removal, they passed reforms to the hydrocarbon laws, which basically roll back many of the Chavez-era restrictions on private ownership and investment in their country. It doesn't go far enough. It probably needs to do more, but that's extraordinary. That never would have happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. It certainly wouldn't have happened if Maduro was still there. So I think these are signs of progress. Do they still have political prisoners? They do. But many are increasingly being released every single day, and some are actually being released and beginning to speak out again. And we're going to watch very closely how they're treated and how that happens, because that'll be part of how we judge them and their actions.
You
not
touched
words.
on my second question, which is this long history of very sordid history for outside investors coming into Venezuela. And the president and you had a meeting with our energy leaders in the Oval Office to talk about the opportunity to invest. And there was, worries about the safety of investing. What steps beyond what you just described in terms of the hydrocarbon law, security guarantees for workers, any sorts of certainty that investors are gaining, which is going to allow them to have the confidence to move on the opportunities of Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, the first step is some of these investors or potential investors need to get a license from OFAC to be able to even explore this. Then they need to be able to go down there and meet with people and see what's happening and make that determination. Here's what I would say. Venezuela has a lot of oil. They do. But there's a lot of oil in other places too. Companies are only going to invest somewhere if they know we're going to invest, we're going to make our money back with a profit, and our land isn't going to be taken from us. And if you try to, there's a court we can go to and contracts we can enforce. That's the level of certainty that we're talking in terms of security. And that's part of this transition process. That's part of this recovery process, is to normalize their industry. Because if not, they'll just invest the money in Guyana, or they'll just invest the money in some other part of the world that has oil. They're not going to risk it. So it's to their benefit to have set up a normal, transparent process that encourages foreign investment, not just in oil, by the way, and other natural resources, but in other sectors of their economy. I mean, it's unlimited, whether it's retail, whether it's banking. I mean, a country that's prosperous and generating economic activity holds the promise of all sorts of economic
I'm going
activity.
to try to squeeze in one more question, if
Yeah.
we could, just in my remaining seconds, just very briefly. We've heard such differing accounts, and the president has spoken strongly, you have as well, on the deaths in Iran and the horrible atrocities that are being committed. Can you give us some sense of, we see reports of thousands, tens of thousands. What's the State Department's best estimate of what's happened on the ground?
Well, I don't, in the thousands for certain. And look, I think regimes, including that one in Iran, have learned that when you start shooting people in the head with snipers, it's effective. I mean, it works, and they've done it, and it's horrifying. And that's what we've seen. That regime is probably weaker than it has ever been. And the core problem they face, unlike the protests you saw in the past on some other topics, is that they don't have a way to address the core complaints of the protesters, which is that their economy's in collapse. And the reason why there's economies in collapse is because they spend all their money and all their resources building weapons and sponsoring terrorist groups around the world instead of reinvesting it back into their society. And as a result, have taken on massive global sanctions, which has isolated their economy and their country. And so that's what the Iranian people are demanding, is that they stop doing that and start caring about them and get these sanctions off them. And this regime is unwilling to do it. So the core challenge is the protests may have ebbed, but they will spark up again in the future, because this regime, unless they are willing to change and or leave, have no way of addressing the legitimate and consistent complaints of the people of Iran who deserve better.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I think the scope of the project that you are undertaking in Venezuela is without precedent. You are taking their oil at gunpoint. You are holding and selling that oil, putting for now the receipts in an offshore Middle Eastern account. You're deciding how and for what purposes that money is going to be used in a country of 30 million people. I think a lot of us believe that that is destined for failure. And I know that you're telling us today just to be patient, but a month later, we have no information on a timetable for a democratic transition. Maduro's people are still in charge. Most of the political prisoners are in jail. And by the way, those that have been let out have a gag order on them from the government. The opposition leader is still in exile. This looks already like it is a failure. You say you're in serious talks, but as you note, the Venezuelans are great at being in serious talks. They almost never deliver. So I'm just going to give you my three questions and hope that you'll answer them, because I do think we want to try to understand how to judge the efficacy of this as time goes on, because I worry you won't be back before this committee anytime soon, and to understand whether this is just facilitating corruption, both in Venezuela and here at home. So here are my three questions. First, reports are that you've given no-bid licenses to two companies to sell Venezuela's oil. One of them is a massive donor to the president. To many Americans, that reeks. And so my question is, can you commit that partners for future sales are going to be chosen through a fair, open selection process? Second, if Delcy Rodriguez, who is an unelected leader, the head of Maduro's torture operation, is still in power 6 months from now, does that mean that your policy is a success or failure? How do we judge when we've had enough of Rodriguez? And third, in your testimony, you reserved the right to use force again in the future if the Venezuelan government isn't complying with your requests. So if, for instance, they refused to give you access to the oil in the future, if they said, we're just going to keep it for ourselves, would this cause you to consider military action? And do you concede that if you're using military action simply to try to compel cooperation from the government, you absolutely need congressional authorization for that? So if you can answer those three.
Yeah, so the first question was about the trading companies. The second is about Delcy still in power 6 months from now.
6 months from now.
And the third is on the use of force.
Yes.
Okay. On the first one, the two traders. So here's the problem we faced. The problem we faced in the short term is they had no place to put oil. They were running out of storage capacity for their oil. We had to move that oil to market very quickly. The only way to move it to market very quickly is to plug into these two primary trade companies that could sell it in the open market. That is not the permanent outcome here. That is a short-term fix to a short-term problem, which is they were literally storing oil. They brought in tankers and had tankers sitting offshore just to hold their oil. At some point, their capacity to produce was going to be shut down, and their ability to generate revenue. So we had to move that oil very quickly. The long-term plan is not those two trading companies. The long-term plan is for them to have a normal energy program that sells directly into the market, directly, to refineries and to companies that are exploiting and exploring it. For example, Chevron has operations there that never stopped. They seek to expand those operations. They don't need those trading companies. So those trading companies were a short-term fix for a very acute problem because we wanted to prevent societal collapse because they had no money for revenue. On the second point about her being still in power, look, let me say this, a couple things. This is not unprecedented. I can point to a number of places, Spain, Paraguay, two examples of places in which there was a transition, from an autocratic regime to a democratic regime, and it took time. I can't give you a timeline of how long it takes. It can't take forever. It's not even been 4 weeks
Is
since
6
Maduro
months,
was
a year, two
Well, I think we
years?
need to be, let me put it to you this way, we need to be much further along 6 months from now, even 3 months from now. That may not be satisfactory to you, but I'm saying we have to be much further along 3, 4, 5 months. 3 or 4, 5 months from now cannot look like what today looks like. And I think there's acknowledgement on both sides of that. I can probably give you a better answer, and this is not deflecting, when we finally have people on the ground like the ambassador and the team around her on a daily basis that are interacting. Because one thing is for me to pick up the phone and talk to Delcy Rodriguez 3 times a week. Another thing is to have someone on the ground on a daily basis that's following these events, is talking to civil society, but also engaging with interim authorities. But the fact of the matter is that, yes, we want to see quick progress. As you said, it's unprecedented, okay? All I'm saying to you is, before this was stagnant. Before this, we had spent 14 years, you were involved in some of those efforts, 14 years trying to change the dynamic in Venezuela. 13, 12, 11, 10, it was a big part of my career in the Senate was spent on this. This is the first time in over a decade that we see even the glimmer of an opportunity to change conditions. A lot of that will depend on us, but a lot of that will depend on them. And it also will depend on the rest of Venezuelan society. How quickly can we get all these Venezuelans that want to go back to Venezuela and participate in civic and economic life back to Venezuela? That's going to be critical here. We recognize that. So yes, we have to be much further along in 6 months. We expect to be further along. And if we're not, I'll tell you, we'll tell you. On the third point of use of force, look, the president never rules out his options as commander-in-chief to protect the national interest of the United States. I can tell you right now with full certainty, we are not postured to, nor do we intend or expect to have to take any military action in Venezuela at any time. The only military presence you will see in Venezuela is our Marine Guards at an embassy. Okay, that is our goal, that is our expectation, and that is what everything that outlines towards.
But if you-
That said, if an Iranian drone factory pops up and threatens our forces in the region, the president retains the option to eliminate that threat.
I'm asking a more specific question because in your testimony, you suggest that you would use force to compel cooperation, for instance, with oil sales. Do you agree that you have to come to Congress to get authorization if you were simply using force to try to compel cooperation?
Well, there's two things. There's the
It seems like
under the War Powers Act. No, under the War Powers Act, if we're going to be involved in something, that's going to put us involved in a sustained way. We have to notify you within 48 hours after the fact, and then if it's going to last longer than 60 days, we have to come to Congress with it. We don't anticipate either of these things having to happen. Everything is moving in a very different trajectory right now. On the other hand, if we tell them we don't want to see drones from Iran, as an example, pointed at the United States or threatening our forces or our presence in the region or our allies' presence in the region, and they refuse to comply with that, the president does reserve the option in self-defense to eliminate that threat. We don't see that, we don't anticipate it, but it could happen. But we hope not. We don't want it to happen. On the contrary, if we had to take military action, it would set us back on all these other things that we're talking about. I can tell you, military action is not good for, recovery and transition. That's not what we hope to see. It's certainly not our goal here. A lot of that will depend on them. But I think it would require the emergence of an imminent threat of the kind that we do not anticipate at this time. But that's not, they get a vote on that too.
Senator Brasso.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, great to see you. Congratulations. What you and President Trump have demonstrated in the past year is clearly peace through strength, and I appreciate the leadership from both of you. We've talked a lot about Venezuelan oil. You know, I focus a lot on energy going to China, and 3/4 of all the oil that went from Venezuela out of the country there last year, 75% of it went to China. They got it at deep discounts. Lots of money back to Venezuela through oil for loan deals. Since the start of this blockade, basically Venezuela crude shipments to China have fallen dramatically. Can you assess or talk a little bit about the impact this has on China's broader energy strategy?
Just to be clear, it's a quarantine, not a blockade. A blockade is an act of war. It's a quarantine, and it's been very effective in the sense that it's given us this leverage. In fact, can I just add something, and this might be to Senator Murphy's question as well. The Venezuelan authorities are now identifying ships that they want us to grab. In fact, about a week and a half ago, we grabbed one of these ships. That was, because here's what happened in the aftermath of the Maduro. About 5 ships took off without authorization from the Venezuelans because they were controlled by some network in the country. With the cooperation of the interim authorities, we seized one of those ships. We brought it back into Venezuelan waters, handed the ship off to the Venezuelans, who in turn fed it into this mechanism, this short-term mechanism that I described to you was created. So we're seeing cooperation on that front. Now, I think your question more specifically was about China. Yeah, so look, China can buy Venezuelan oil, but they're going to have to buy it like everybody else in the world is going to have to buy it. Yeah, at the normal price. And that money is going to flow back to the benefit of the Venezuelan people in a structured way. And I know that in the short term, that will involve this mechanism we've described. In the long term, our intention is that it would be governed by a democratically elected government. You know, I mean, that like a normal country would handle it. But it's not just about oil. There's other economic activity, the full spectrum. I mean, Venezuela was, and still, we're not talking about some third world country here. I mean, we're talking about a country that doesn't just have wealth, it has memory, it has history of economic activity, of people who own chains of pharmacies. I know some of these people who own chains of retail stores, including American retailers who had a presence there. We just want it to be a normal, prosperous country again, not a playground for Iran, Russia, and China in our own hemisphere. And we're going to try to help them get that because we think it serves our national interest. That will require actions on our part, not money, but ultimately that will require them. This is ultimately going to be on the Venezuelan people and Venezuelan society and Venezuelan leaders to make this happen. We're going to be there to help and assist and create the parameters for it, and we feel like we're making really good progress. If we make as much progress over the next 4 weeks as we've made in the last 3.5 weeks, I'll feel very good about that. If it slows down or it gets complicated, I'll certainly let you know. But our anticipation is that we're going to be able to continue to work cooperatively with them because it's in their interest and ours. But I will point out to this, after this operation happened, look at the people who criticized it. I mean, there were others. China, Russia, Iran, Hamas. These are the people that were upset about this strike and this raid and what we did. And I can tell you that in many countries in the Western Hemisphere, there was great pleasure in the fact that Maduro was removed and that it didn't involve an all-out war and an invasion.
Since you mentioned Iran, and Senator McCormick mentioned Iran as well, a lot of oil is still going from Iran to China. 1 million barrels a day last year. Lots of that money goes back to Iran, to the dictators, the people that are actually killing others on the street. Can you talk a little bit about what we can do to prevent that from continuing to go and what we're doing to support the Iranian?
Some of that is sanctioned oil. This requires the willingness to enforce those sanctions. And obviously that comes with a cost-benefit analysis. The Iranians are also capable of seizing ships and doing that in retribution. But that's certainly something that will be under consideration, and others have done that in the past. And we have seized, for example, weapons shipments in the past that involve Iranian, and in fact, some of the ships, Remember, all of these ships that we're seizing with the oil are with court orders. They're either one or two things. We either have a court order from a federal judge that allows us to seize it because it's in violation of a sanction, or it's a flagless vessel in the shadow fleet. And many of these ships here involve Iran. And some of that oil was going to be ultimately transferred to the excess refining capacity that China currently has.
As you mentioned the word shadow fleet, Senator Shaheen and I have legislation on subsea cables. I've asked you about that the last time we were here. The sabotage being done, directly being targeted. I know that Sweden and Finland have both detained Russian ships along those lines. We're going to have a markup on that bill tomorrow. Is that something you continue to support our efforts to go after?
It is, and it's featured prominently in the agenda, both at the G7 this year, as it did somewhat last year, but again this year in the G7 will be one of the top items we'll be discussing. And we've also been pushing it as a priority for NATO to consider. The two new things we want NATO to make a priority this year in our conversations are the undersea cable infrastructure and Arctic security, and the third is critical minerals and supply chains. Because ultimately, you can spend all the money in the world on weapons. If you can't make them because you're missing some chip that requires some mineral that China controls, you're in a lot of trouble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Kane.
Thank you. We started this operation on September 2nd with the attack on Venezuelans and boats in open waters. And now we are nearly 5 months in. Next week is 5 months. Finally, a public hearing. Wow, how novel. Finally, a public hearing in the Senate or House. This is the first public hearing we've had. 200 folks who are on secret designated combatant lists have been killed. U.S. troops have been injured. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent. An armada amassed. The announcement of a new Monroe Doctrine, which does not land well in the Americas. Democrats have been asking over and over again, can we have a public hearing? Can we share what we know with the American public? Finally, a public hearing. But even that hearing is constrained. I'd like to talk about the complete weakness of the legal rationale about the strikes on boats in international waters, but I can't because the administration has only shared it with members in a classified setting. I can't tell you why the domestic rationale is hollow and the international rationale is hollow. I can't tell you why the rationale for attacking Venezuela is hollow because, again, the rationale has been shared with us in a closed setting. I can't share with you the grim details of the murder of shipwrecked survivors in open waters that we all know because we've seen the videos and we've questioned the U.S. military officials involved about legality because the administration will not release that publicly. They released the boat strike videos publicly, but they hid the second strike that killed struggling shipwreck survivors, even from Congress, for nearly 3 months, but I can't really talk to you about it. I can't talk to you about the weakness of the targeting criteria being used to attack boats in the Caribbean and Pacific. I would encourage any colleague, if you have not, go to the classified setting and ask for a briefing on each strike and ask this question: what was the evidence that there were narcotics on that craft? You will be very surprised if you ask that question about every strike. And so even in this first public hearing, 5 months in, there's a lot we can't talk about. If it was such a righteous operation, why is the administration and the majority in this Senate so jealously protecting the details about it from being revealed to the American public? I have Virginians deployed in this operation. I can't answer their families' questions. Thank God we're having a public hearing 5 months in. This is supposed to be the greatest deliberative body in the world. Mr. Secretary, who won the July 2024 Venezuelan presidential election?
Oh, I think the whole world would acknowledge it was Edmundo Gonzalez.
Who lost that election?
Maduro.
And his vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. Now, you have made the decision, the administration has made the decision in the aftermath of the attack that Delcy Rodriguez should be leading the country. Let me read something that President Trump said about her on January 14 about Delcy Rodriguez, who lost the election with Maduro. We just had a great conversation today, and she's a terrific person. I mean, she's somebody that we have worked with very well. Let me tell you what Delcy Rodriguez said the day after Venezuela was attacked. Governments around the world are simply shocked that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is the victim and target of an attack of this nature, which undoubtedly has Zionist undertones. What the hell did Delcy Rodriguez mean when she said this attack had Zionist undertones? I'm assuming you have no idea.
Oh, I have an idea what she meant. I mean, what's the question?
What does she mean when she says this attack has Zionist undertones?
Look, I have to answer, but let me understand in a broader context. No one here is telling you that this is what we want to see in the long term.
Okay.
This is not a campaign to leave in place the system that's currently in place.
Let me switch.
But we either have,
me-
no, but I mean, the criticism
No,
of us is,
I'm
all right, go
now-
ahead. No, go ahead.
I'm ready to switch now to talk about somebody that you
Thought you
know
raised an
well.
important point. If I can get back to it, I will.
You know well and you respect well Maria Corina Machado. Here's what President Trump said about her. Won the Nobel Prize in the aftermath of the attack on Venezuela. I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect. What did President Trump mean by that?
Yeah. First of all, I've known Maria Corina for probably 12 years,
I know you
13
have.
years. Have dealt with her probably more than as much as anybody on this committee has for certain. And I'll be meeting with her today, in fact. And we met with her a couple weeks ago. So here's the reality, though, and I think what the president was pointing to. And I think Maria Corina would acknowledge this. The only way
I talked to her last week.
Well, here's
Very disappointed in those comments, and so are Venezuelans in my state.
okay. Well,
Very-
she didn't share that with me or with us, but I would sell this to you. For the president is acknowledging is that today, as it stands, whether we like it or not, the elements of control in that country, the people with the guns, the people that control the guns and the institutions of government there, are in the hands of this regime. So we either, on the one hand, we're getting criticized. Some people are saying we don't want regime change. On the other hand, we're being criticized for not undertaking regime change.
Mr. Secretary,
What we're trying to trigger here is a process of stabilization, recovery, and transition
You-
to something where Maria Corina and others can be a part of.
You
and that's
have,
what we're
you
working
have
for.
respect for her, don't you?
Sure.
Okay, great. My last question is this.
And so does the president, by the way. He met with her. They had a great meeting. And he actually he spoke to her last
here's
week
what he
in my
said.
presence.
Here's what he said after that meeting. We're talking to her, and maybe we can get her involved in some way. I'd love to be able to do that. Maybe we can do that. We'll set the terms for this Nobel Prize winner having a leadership role. Last question is this. You talked about the speech in Davos. Here's something the president said in Davos. I'm helping NATO until the last few days when I told them about Iceland. They loved me. They're not here for us on Iceland, that I can tell you. Our stock market took the first dip yesterday because of Iceland, so Iceland has already cost us a lot of money. President repeatedly mistook Iceland for Greenland, right? We're not mad at Iceland. They haven't cost us any money. The president just mistook the two countries for each other, correct?
Yeah, he meant to say Greenland, but I think we're all familiar with presidents that have verbal stumbles. We've had presidents like that before. Some made a lot more than this one.
Nice try. Thanks.
All right, thank you. I thought he did well. Let's see, we got Senator Paul.
Our founders debated extensively over which branch of government should have the power to declare or initiate war. Virtually unanimously, they decided, and what was entered into the Constitution was that the declaration or initiation of war would be the power of Congress. Now, we have many advocates, many of whom are here today, who have been advocates for an expansive notion of presidential power. They often argue that wars are not really wars, that they're kinetic actions or drug busts. I think, though, if you reverse the circumstances, it becomes very difficult for these arguments to hold up. So I would ask you, if a foreign country bombed our air defense missiles, captured and removed our president, and blockaded our country, would that be considered an act of war?
Well, I think your question is about and I will acknowledge you've been very consistent on all these points the entire career. So let me no matter who's in charge. So I will point to two things. The first is it's hard for us to conceive that an operation that lasted about 4.5 hours and was a law enforcement operation to capture someone we don't recognize as a head of state, indicted in the United States,
All right,
wanted with a $50 million
my
bounty.
question would be, if it only took 4 hours to take our president, it's very short, nobody dies on the other side, nobody dies on our side, it's perfect. Would it be an act of war?
We just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close to the constitutional definition of
But
war.
would it be an act of war if someone did it to us? Nobody dies, few casualties, they're in and out. boom, it's a perfect military operation. Would that be an act of war? Of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate, and I would vote to declare war if someone invaded our country and took our president. So I think we need to at least acknowledge this is a one-way argument. One-way arguments that don't rebound, that you can't apply to yourselves, that cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments. So my next question would be, let's say it's not a war, and we're just going to define it away and say it's not a war. That's one of the arguments. So it's a drug bust. What if a foreign country indicts our president for violating a foreign law? Should we extradite our president, or should we be okay if they come in and get him by force?
Look, I think ultimately we're always going to act in our national interest. And so if somebody comes after our national interest, like the case you've described, which obviously does not exist at this time, but the case you've described, the U.S. always has the right to act in its national interest and to protect itself.
So really
I
it's
don't know about this equivalency. Well, does this justify them doing it? We're always going to do what's best for the United States and America. We're always going to protect our system.
But the point isn't, and you're exactly right, we will act in our national interest and we should. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. What I'm saying is, though, that our arguments are empty then. The drug bust isn't really an argument, it's a ruse. The war argument, not a war, is a ruse. It's not a real argument. And we do what we do because we have the force, we have the might, we do it because it's in our interest. So we wouldn't let anybody come in, bomb us, blockade us, and take our president. We've had arguments about legitimate, illegitimate presidents, bad elections, rigged elections. So there's all kinds of same arguments that we've had in our country that they've had in Venezuela. But we wouldn't argue for an indictment. And these things aren't idle speculation. I mean, Netanyahu's been indicted by the ICC. And one of the reasons I object to being part of the ICC, and I would say you and the administration probably agree, is we're not going to let any international council indict our president and arrest him somewhere on foreign soil. We're not going to do that. We actually, most of us probably object to indicting Netanyahu in that way as well. So I think the arguments are invalid. So we did get the legal opinion that Senator Kaine referred to, the OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel. And I think a lot of it's been released. Plus they came to our caucus and talked most of the open about everything they had classified. So I will talk about at least one of the arguments. They say this war wasn't a constitutional war, therefore it doesn't rise to the constitutional notion of us declaring or having to initiate the war. It just doesn't rise. And one of their main arguments was not enough people died. And so there is some number that they aren't specific, but there is some number. I would assume, although I'm not positive, but the 50, 60,000 soldiers who died in Vietnam might be enough for them to call that a war. But here's the problem. It isn't the number, it's that it happens in retrospect. See, our founders gave us the power to initiate or declare war. They didn't give us other powers to execute the war. Those are left to the president. But if we have to wait to see how many people are killed, we have to wait, as they describe it, as the scope, nature, and extent. If we have to wait to see the scope, nature, and extent, the war has been going on for some time. It's hard to vote to initiate a war that's been going on. And we can say this war is over, but we're still blockading it, and we may go back in. But there are no clear answers. You know, we put 2,000, we lose 2,000 troops in. Are we going to call that war and initiate it? So the definition of war is very important. And I think we have to acknowledge the problems with our argument. Calling things kinetic action is a disservice to our soldiers. Oh, you weren't really wounded in war. You don't have a Medal of Honor for war. You have a Medal of Honor for a kinetic action. So I think let's call it what it is, and let's vote on these things. But I think we're in violation of both the spirit and the law of the Constitution by bombing a capital, blockading a country, and removing elected officials. And we certainly wouldn't tolerate it, nor would I if someone did it to us.
Well, we didn't remove an elected official. We removed someone who was not elected, and it was actually an indicted drug trafficker in the United States. And their system...
Our laws, indicted under our laws. Look, Bolsonaro says that Da Silva is not really the president of Brazil. Our president said Biden wasn't really the president. Hillary Clinton said in 2016 Trump wasn't the president. So you have these arguments, and I agree with you, it probably was, and most likely was, most assuredly was a bad election. He wasn't really elected. But at the same time, if that's our predicate, and you don't have to come to us because it's a drug bust, we're just removing somebody, you can see where it leads to, and it leads to chaos. And that's why we have rules like the Constitution, so we don't get so far out there that presidents can do whatever they want. It is this check and balance. And I would argue for 70 years we've been going the wrong way. It isn't just this president, but it's a debate that I think is worth having.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to associate myself with the comments of Tim Kaine. The fact that we're 5 months into this and this is the first oversight hearing is really a complete failure of the responsibility of Congress, failure of this committee to demand oversight, but also a reflection of the reluctance of the administration to engage in the proper consultation with Congress. So I hope we can do a lot better going forward, and that we'll see you at least every 6 weeks or so, not every five months. I also feel like the strategy of keeping basically these very weak arguments secret so that they can't be discussed openly for the legal justifications. I've gone down and read them, and there's a reason you know, obviously you'd be incredibly embarrassed if those were public, so make them public. Let's have an actual transparency here in the United States of America. And let's be clear about what has gone on. We had a dictator we didn't like. We've replaced it with a dictator we think we can manipulate. And if that doesn't work, we'll do something else in order to pry open that economy for oil. And I must say that you did say something I liked. So let me emphasize that.
I'm making progress.
Yeah. You said no U.S. taxpayer dollars will be used, no spending on our part, to kind of prop up Venezuela. Can you restate your commitment to that?
Yeah, they're not going to need it. For example, we're not spending money in Venezuela right now. I mean, obviously, look, I think you're putting aside embassy operations and all of that. And by the way, there may be some program through foreign aid that some of you might be interested in the future. We don't think that Venezuela is the kind of country that needs that. This is a very wealthy country.
Thank you. I'm glad you restated that, because I think that we will see some moment when the administration says, let's subsidize our American oil companies to rebuild the infrastructure in Venezuela. And I must say that's a very unpopular idea among my constituents. I think America needs a lot of investments in infrastructure here. And I think you have a way too rosy sense of the oil economy there. Many experts have said, look, without 10-year prospect horizon of stability, without Canada deciding to ship a lot more of its heavy oil from, instead of to the Gulf, doing it to Asia so that we prop up the kind of demand in the Gulf, without keeping Iran off the international stage so that the cost of oil, the value is higher. All of those factors would have to be there for our oil companies to want to invest their own money. So I think they'll be coming to the administration. I think you'll all be trying to find some way to subsidize them. But I'm glad what you said today, that you're not going to do it, and I want to hold the administration accountable to that. Second, on terms of the $500 million fund, $300 million, my understanding, has gone back to the Central Bank of Venezuela, and they have essentially exchanged it for bolivars to key industry players. I don't think we have any transparency on what corporations or entities got that hard currency, and yet you did say there's going to be a lot of transparency. You also said, if I understood right, that those funds are eventually going to be brought back into the structure of U.S. control as part of our, formal structure of funds. And in that sense, the Constitution says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made in law. So are you going to make sure that if that money comes back into kind of full U.S. control, not an offshore account the way it is now, that we're going to abide by the Constitution? Third point here is that one of the things that transpired is cutting off the oil to Cuba. And I know you have a strong interest in making life difficult for the leadership in Cuba. Can you lay out for us what other things you might be planning in that regard and how those fit into an overall plan?
Yeah, well, I'll try to do that in a minute. Let me just say, on the rosy projections of oil, it's not rosy projection. I mean, it's either going to happen or it's not. In essence, oil, there's no world in which the United States is subsidizing investment in Venezuelan oil. It's very simple. Oil company will go in and say, okay, this is the oil you have. This is how much it's going to cost us investing on the front end to one end make money, pay back our investment plus a profit at the back end, and then depending on the terms of that investment, they'll make a decision about whether it makes sense for that or not. Right now, what you have in Venezuela is a corrupt and broken oil company run by the government that basically takes this money, doesn't reinvest in it at all, and basically sprinkles it to its people to keep the glue that keeps the regime together. We want it to become a normal oil economy. That's what the ultimate goal is here. And in a normal oil economy, companies are going to go in, they're going to look at Venezuelan law, they're going to look at Venezuelan authorities, and they're going to make a determination about whether or not it's worth their investment. And that's the normalization process that we're talking about. That's going to be up to them. If they want to have a normal oil economy as opposed to one that is basically used as a way to feed graft in a very inefficient way, but they didn't care about that. If they do it the right way, we think it has great promise and potential over the long term, especially because these investments take a long time. But the U.S. doesn't have to put any money to encourage companies to go in and invest, nor is there any interest in doing so. But a lot of it.
That's a point I really do appreciate.
Yeah, no,
I don't want to see.
Well, I don't even think
American
that's even
taxpayer
been.
dollars going in.
I don't think that's even been discussed or considered by anybody. Your second point was, I wrote it here, but now.
It's the $300 million
Since I left here,
being
I started
redistributed
using
to
these, I
corporations in Venezuela and
The second one was what, I'm sorry?
lack of accountability over that. The $300
Oh,
million
yeah.
has already been distributed.
On the account. So that's not the permanent structure we want to see. In the long term, we just want them to have a normal industry where the companies are involved in there, they're selling it directly to the market, and we're out of that game. What we're talking about now is the sanctioned oil, the oil that's under our sanction. So we have to monitor how that money moves. So yes, the first 300 million moved for the following reason. We would all agree we didn't want to see systemic collapse. Like one of the things a lot of you told me you were worried about on the short term is this is going to trigger internal chaos in Venezuela. 1 million people are going to storm the border with Colombia. Colombia even stood up troops to their border to prevent it. Brazil was worried about it as well. It's going to lead to fighting in the streets between rival factions and shooting. None of that has happened. And key to that stabilization is ensuring that the government had enough money to meet payroll and meet their basic needs as part of the stabilization. We should not confuse stabilization with transition. This is not what the permanent structure is going to look like. The Treasury's handling the structuring of that account, so I would refer you to them and I can get you an answer for them as to what the legal framework of that Treasury blocked account
That'd be
is
very
gonna look
helpful
like.
because what you just mentioned, money to meet payroll, is very different than what we've heard about the money being used to give hard currency to key corporations inside of Venezuela, which would not be meeting payroll.
Well, which
This is where
corporations?
complete oversight is required.
Well-
We'd like to have transparency over how that's being
Yeah, remember, the first 300 million, we're going to have to, on that one, because of the urgency in moving funds to keep the place stable, is going to require us to undertake a retroactive audit of how that money was spent, the first 300 million. But there's probably another 2.5 to 3 billion down the pike at some point, which will have front end through this process I described. I'm not sure if you were here where I described it, and we're still finalizing it. But basically, the way it would look is we would send them a letter saying, on the sanctioned oil proceeds, this is what it could be spent on, and you have to agree to contribute, you have to agree to pay for an auditing system to make sure that that's how it's being spent. That's the process we're trying to create. Again, on Friday, we'll mark the 4-week mark of this all began. I understand, we live in a world where the items move very quickly. This was front page news of 3 weeks ago when we scheduled this hearing, and today other items have captured the attention, but we remain focused on it. So it's only been 3 or 4 weeks, but that's the process we're setting up with Treasury, and obviously as we finalize it, we'll provide that to you. But this is not permanent. This is not the system we want to see in place in the long term. We want to see a normal country. What was your third question?
Cuba.
Oh, Cuba.
Cuba.
Okay. I'll tell you about Cuba.
Secretary Rubio, as you know, in our home state, this was very popular. Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, basically everybody in Latin America has been fighting. A lot of them are in Miami, as you know, because they've had to leave these countries because of socialism and lack of opportunity. So what the president did, the willingness of the president with your support and with Pete Hegseth's and military was very, very, very well thought of. So the first thing I want to say is on behalf of Floridians, thank you for what you guys did. Now, the next is everybody has these ridiculously high expectations, which we all do. We would love to have a free and fair election tomorrow, where there was you knew that there was no oppression. Everybody wanted to run; they could run. So, tell us how should Venezuelans and Cubans and Nicaraguans look at this, and how patient should they be, and what would be the milestones you would give them to look at to say we are making progress?
Well, first I'll remind everybody, let's just go back 6 months, 8 months, a year ago at this time. The Venezuelan challenge for us was frozen. It was a frozen situation. We had a regime that was entrenched. Its opposition was either in hiding or had been forced overseas. Edmundo Gonzalez lives in Spain. Maria Corina is no longer, she's very brave. She stood there as long as she could, but she had to leave. The others are in jail. They were increasing their relationships and outreach with Iran, and currently have existing ones with Russia, Cuba, and China. And other than more sanctions and more speeches and more threats and whatever, it was a frozen situation. Now, for the first time in literally a decade, there is the opportunity that something could change. There's not the guarantee that something will change, but there is the opportunity that something will change. We have changed that dynamic, which goes back to the question that Senator Merkley had about Cuba. What we are looking for is the opportunity for a change in dynamic. That's a country that's been backwards. It has no functional economy. The people, you can call them Marxist, we can call them communist, but not even Lenin would recognize this version of communism and Marxism that they've instilled in Cuba. It's an economic model that hasn't worked anywhere on the planet. The suffering in the rural areas of Cuba are acute and they're deep, and it's not because of the embargo, it's because they don't know how to run an economy. How is it the fault of the U.S. embargo that Cuba, one of the world's largest sugar producers, now imports sugar? Because no sector of their society works. It's frozen and it's broken. But in the case of Venezuela, we have a glimmer of hope now, the opportunity to change the dynamic. Now, what that will require is smart decisions on our part, but ultimately it will require decisions made by Venezuelans, both those currently in charge of the interim authorities and those who may be in charge in the future as well, to step forward. It is our sincere belief that the only way you're going to have a free, prosperous Venezuela that's allied with the United States is one in which every sector of their society is represented in their politics. And that includes many people who currently live abroad. And even the opposition, people like to say the opposition is very diverse. There are members of the opposition that were once part of Chavismo and turned against it. There are members of the opposition that have never been Chavistas, like Maria Corina Machado, and have been very forceful against it. So that broad sector has to be represented as well. So you have to have a process of internal reconciliation that allows these voices to begin to participate in the political life of that country, and that ultimately bring us to a point in which you can have a country where all of these elements of their society are represented in their politics. And look, there's a percentage of the Venezuelan population, I don't know what the number is, whether it's 15 or 20, that may not have liked Maduro, but are still committed to Chavista ideology. And they'll be represented in that platform as well. They may not win elections, but they'll be involved in this. That'll be up to the Venezuelan people. But our desire here is to have, what's the end state? We want a Venezuela that has legitimate democratic elections, sometimes elects leaders that are friendly to the United States, sometimes elects leaders that maybe are not the person we would have wanted to win, but that's not unique for us. That happens all over the world. We're not disputing that Petro is the legitimately elected president of Colombia, and yet he doesn't always say nice things about us. So, but we also want a Venezuela that's prosperous, and a Venezuela that's aligned with the United States. And a year ago at this time, this was frozen. Now we have a real opportunity, not just to create change systemically within that country through our help, but their efforts, but also one that is no longer a base of operation, the central base of operation for every geopolitical adversary we have. And that's what Venezuela was under Maduro. And that's what we hope and intend to change.
So would you, if you're a Venezuelan that lives in Miami, so what you would say is that you're working hard. There's a lot of variables outside your control, but you'd say right now, political prisoners are being released, never fast enough. The oppression is being reduced, not fast enough. Opposition leaders are speaking up more and more. So we're making progress, and you're going to continue to control the oil to make sure that, that we continue down this path.
What I would say is that we share the same goal and the same outcome we want for Venezuela. And the question is, we have to do it through a realistic process and it has the highest chance of success. Okay, the way to view it, if you use the medical analogy, is this is a critically ill patient that has suffered some very serious things. They've broken their leg, but they also have a ruptured, spleen or something. You've got to deal with the life-threatening first before you deal with a broken leg. And even when you deal with a broken leg, there's going to be a period of rehabilitation. You don't just go from having your leg repaired in a surgery to running on a treadmill the next day. There's going to have to be a process here. But the process has an arrow moving towards accomplishments, achievements, and positive things. What I would say to the people who I know quite well as you do is, for the first time in over a decade and a half, there is the real possibility of transformation. And a lot of it will depend on them, because there are many people living in Florida and across the country who would like to go back and be a part of Venezuelan economic life. Many of them are eager to do so. And they're going to need them. Venezuela is going to need them to come back and rebuild the businesses that were taken or lost and engage themselves in both civic and economic life. But again, I remind everybody, on Friday will mark the 4 weeks since this happened. I get it. We all want like something immediately, but this is not a frozen dinner you put in a microwave and in 2.5 minutes it comes out ready to eat. And these are complex things, and we've seen this play out. I've used the example of Paraguay and Spain. There are others where there's a transition from autocracy to democracy. It's not linear. It's, in some cases, there are ups and downs along the way, but it's trending in the right direction so far, with a recognition that, you know, more work needs to be done.
Thanks for your hard work.
Senator Booker.
I just want to start by saying what's plain, frankly, be plain to Senator Rubio and plain to members here, is that it should not have taken this long to have this hearing. Fundamentally, we have a crisis, I believe, in our democracy right now, which is the failure of Congress to do its job, to provide checks and balances, oversight, to provide the kind of constitutionally mandated work that we should be doing to keep a balanced government. We have operations right now that are literally costing the American taxpayer tens of millions of dollars a day. The buildup in the Caribbean alone is hundreds of millions of dollars a month, but we're not providing that kind of oversight that's necessary. So from our power to the purse, to our important work of providing a check and balance to an administration, what we're seeing right now is unacceptable and speaks to what I think is a growing constitutional crisis in our country, which is a Congress that is just lying down for the administration to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. I want to pick up on my colleague's questioning because I actually know from years of conversations with you your heart about human rights in countries like Venezuela, Mr. Secretary. And you issued a travel warning, a level 4 travel advisory from your department's website that says, right now in Venezuela, there's a high risk of wrongful detention, torture, terrorism, kidnapping, arbitrary enforcement of laws, crime, and more. And when we hear from the president that he is in charge, that you all are running this government to that extent, I have a lot of concerns when it comes to the rampant human rights violations that are persisting. Cabello is Maduro's key hardline enforcer. He's continued to intimidate and suppress Venezuelan voices. He remains in control of Venezuela's security forces, security services, the colectivos. We're seeing extraordinary examples that the constant oppression of the people is continuing as these folks are remaining in control of the country. So I just want to know, what is the plan to address in a much more aggressive manner these severe human rights violations and to try to stop these armed militias? Because if we are doing things to stabilize their government, if we're turning over resources and money to the very groups that are creating these horrors, that seems to me against America's values, and it seems to me something that is should be unacceptable to Congress on both sides.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The Venezuela I described that we want to see emerge from this is one in which none of that is happening. If you think about travel advisories are us imagining worst case scenarios. We have a duty to warn American citizens when they travel to a place that does have a history of Americans being arrested, of Americans being taken. And they may be taken by a deliberate action of a government or entity related to the regime. They may be taken by criminal gangs that control parts of that society. For example, you know, they have these colectivos, as they're called, which basically are these armed motorcycle gangs that are allowed to act with impunity in return for their support for the Maduro regime in the past. You have the ELN and the FARC and other drug trafficking organizations, including Tren de Aragua, that are involved.
Again.
So these are real risks that we have a duty to warn Americans, because here's what we didn't want to see, and don't mean to interrupt you. We have this announcement that Maduro's been taken. All of a sudden, people conclude, oh, he's gone, let's flood over there, let's all go over there, and we could expose people to danger.
But this is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they are, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're
Well, why
describing is...
lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Trained at Agua, but there were Trained at Agua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them, we are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations, and that needs to stop. And I think
just on 2 points, we're not cooperating with them to continue doing what they're doing now. We're cooperating with them to transition away from what's happening now. And as I said, we're not even 4 weeks into this thing. And if it continues to look like this in 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, if progress isn't being made, we'll have very different feelings about it. But what we're cooperating on is not the continuation of what's happening. It's a movement away from all this and transitioning ultimately to something that looks nothing like this. That's the goal. But it's been less than 4 weeks. I mean, we think we've made substantial progress in a very short period of time, but I acknowledge we want to make a lot more progress. This is not the end state that we want.
Senator Corder.
Mr. Secretary, I want to expand a little bit on the question that Senator Barrasso raised about Venezuelan oil. But primarily what I want to do is focus on something that's come to be known as the shadow fleet or ghost fleet of Russian and Iranian oil that's been used, that's subject to sanctions, which has, with the complicity of Venezuela, been used to evade sanctions to help fund the Russian war against Ukraine and help Iran remain the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism and fund its proxies, which have been responsible for so much death and misery in the Middle East. So it strikes me that Venezuela, even though it has a lot of oil, has been more involved in trying to assist its allies, namely Iran and Russia, in circumventing these sanctions to help them fund their nefarious activities, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. But obviously they're also a source of additional energy which is needed by China. Can you help us understand that better? And is the law enforcement operation to arrest Nicolas Maduro and the current status of our engagement with Venezuela helping us deal with that ghost fleet or the evasion of sanctions?
Yeah, on the first point, on the second point, absolutely it's helping us deal with it because it's a complex situation to describe. The oil in Venezuela we all think is under the control of one entity, and some of it is, but you literally have a place in which certain individuals, the glue that held the regime together was corruption and graft. Like people said, I'm supportive of this regime, and they didn't, not because they like Nicolas Maduro, but because Nicolas Maduro set up a system that guaranteed them a profit. Some people were making that profit from drugs. Some of them were making it from stealing money from their food program called CLAP. Some of them were making their money from an oil field that was literally given to them in exchange for buying them their loyalty. Some were making their profits from all three, so and other activities. So there's no doubt that his removal has created the conditions to begin to move away from that. That's why we sanction their oil. The ghost fleet exists for the following reason. When something is sanctioned, when we say it is illegal for them to move this oil, none of the traditional legitimate tankers will carry that oil. They won't touch it because they don't want to be sanctioned by the United States. So you have to turn to these pirates. You have to basically turn to these ships that are either falsely flagged, meaning they're flying the flag of Liberia, but they don't really have a Liberian flag, or are stateless in their capacity. And they have to turn to them, and they turn to these vessels. And these vessels are made up with crews from all over the world. We seized one where the majority of the crew members were Ukrainian. We've seized others, the majority of them are Russians, and a mix, and what have you. And so what's happened is a lot of this oil is going, a lot of this shadow fleet oil is going even outside the PDVSA system. And those are the ones that we have now been seizing, as well as the ones that are involved outside the PDVSA system. Our goal is to rope all of this illegal oil into a channel that goes into this account that ultimately goes to the benefit of the Venezuelan people. This is an interim step. This is not the way we want the oil industry to look like in perpetuity. This is simply a way to provide revenue so that there isn't systemic collapse while we work through this recovery and transition phases. So there's no doubt that when Maduro was there, we had no cooperation on any of this. Zero cooperation. But I will tell you this, since the time Maduro was removed, not a single illegal ship has headed towards Venezuela. And the ones that you hear us seizing are all the legacy ones that took off or have been seized in the past. So we have got a really good handle on this as a result of it. And what's really changed is the dynamic that the Venezuelan interim authorities are now actually helping us identify shadow fleet ships that they want us to seize and feed into this new interim mechanism.
So let me turn to Iran. Obviously, the president authorized a strike against their Iranian nuclear program, and what I consider to be a magnificent demonstration of American military power. And even though the arrest of Nicolas Maduro was not primarily a military operation, but they provided the support to law enforcement authorities as they executed an arrest warrant against Nicolas Maduro. Likewise, I think most Americans were very proud of how the U.S. Government and particularly the U.S. military have performed. But I know the president's very concerned about what's happening to the demonstrators in Iran. And of course, there's some estimates that as many as 30,000 Iranian demonstrators have been executed by the regime. But I know the president's being presented with a range of options. We notice a lot of movement into the region by our Navy and other authorities. But what happens if the supreme leader is removed in Iran? What happens next?
Well, that's an open question. I mean, no one knows who would take over. Obviously, their system is divided between the supreme leader and the IRGC that responds directly to him. And then you've got these, quasi-elected individuals, the ones that wear the suits on television who are part of their political branches, but ultimately have to run everything they do by the supreme leader. So I don't think anyone can give you a simple answer as to what happens next in Iran if the supreme leader and the regime were to fall, other than the hope that there would be some ability to have somebody within their systems that you could work towards a similar transition. I would imagine it would be even far more complex than the one we're describing now, because you're talking about a regime that's in place for a very long time. So that's going to require a lot of careful thinking if that eventuality ever presents itself. On the issue of our presence in the region, here's the baseline I want to set for everybody. The baseline is this. We have 30 to 40,000 American troops stationed across 8 or 9 facilities in that region. All are within the reach. Theoretically, not theoretically, in reality, all are within the reach of an array of thousands of Iranian one-way UAVs and Iranian short-term ballistic missiles, short-range.
Voilà, mesdames, messieurs, nous comptons router ensemble avec nous, à toutes les amis qui t'avaient suivi nous, Pstars Radio et télévision, dans le cadre de la présentation secrétaire d'État américain Marco Rubio, qui a pu présenter un briefing, qui a fait un bilan. Les parlementaires américains, également le public américain, autour de l'opération qui a été menée du côté de Venezuela, qui menait à l'arrestation président Nicolas Maduro ainsi que Madame Flores. Nous remercions parce que Léa a avancé ce nom-là pour aller suivre devant le trône, pour aller participer à notre tranche de prière ça, devant le trône où connaissez sa Pstars. C'est évangélisation, information et éducation. Là, nous sortis dans tranche d'information, nous allons tomber dans tranche d'évangélisation et puis après, nous allons retourner avec information qui également c'est un élément d'éducation sur votre réseau qui est Pstars Radio et Télévision. Quel plaisir d'avoir été avec vous, de pouvoir vous servir par le biais de ce réseau. On espère de pouvoir vous rejoindre un peu plus tard. Je vous prie donc de rester accroché à cette fréquence, votre réseau Pstars Radio et Télévision. Merci. Dans quelques bonnes minutes, Madame Katia Valmont-Désir depuis Easton, Massachusetts sera avec vous dans le cadre de cette tranche baptisée Devant le trône sur Pstars Radio et Télévision, votre réseau.